The morning Lenora Rhodes rode into the Kendrick branding grounds with a glowing iron balanced across her saddlebag and fire in her dark eyes. Every man on that dusty plain stopped what he was doing and stared like they had never seen a woman before in all their born days. It was the spring of 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was still a land that chewed up the weak and spat out the ordinary. The grasslands rolled out in every direction like a green and gold ocean, broken only by the jagged teeth of the Laramie Mountains to the west, and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees that marked where water ran beneath the earth. The sky was the kind of relentless blue that made a person feel both free and terrifyingly small, and the smell of wood smoke, burned hide, and cattle sweat hung heavy on the air around the branding fires. Monroe Kendrick had been running the spring branding on his family's Copper Creek ranch for 3 years now, ever since his father had passed and left him the whole of it. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were calloused from fence wire and rope, and the general hard labor of keeping 800 acres alive through Wyoming winters. He had a jaw that his ranch cook, an old woman named Pearl, said looked like it had been carved out of the same granite as the mountains, and eyes so dark brown they looked almost black when he was thinking hard about something. He was not a man who smiled easily, but when he did, Pearl also said it could light up a room better than any kerosene lamp she had ever seen. He was crouched beside a calf, pressing his family's brand into the flank with practiced precision, when one of his cowboys, a wiry young man named Dade Fulton, let out a low whistle from behind him. "Boss," Dade said, "you are going to want to see this." Monroe handed off the iron to the man beside him, stood up, and turned around. She was riding a bay mare that looked like it had been bred for endurance rather than beauty, lean and strong-legged, and the woman herself matched the horse in that same quality. Lenora Rhodes was 26 years old, with dark brown hair pinned back beneath a battered wide-brimmed hat, and a face that was neither delicate nor hard but something in between, the kind of face that had been made honest by weather and grief and stubbornness in equal measure. She wore a work shirt and leather riding gloves, and across her saddlebag, wrapped in a thick piece of canvas to protect it during the ride, rested a branding iron. She dismounted without waiting for an invitation, tied her horse to the fence post, and pulled the iron free from the canvas wrapping. She walked straight toward the fire with the kind of stride that suggested she had absolutely no intention of being turned back. Monroe stepped into her path, not threateningly, just solidly, the way a man does when he wants to establish that there is a conversation to be had before anything else proceeds. "This is a private branding," he said. "Kendrick land." "I know whose land it is," she said, and her voice was clear and unhurried, like she had practiced this moment 100 times on the ride over. "I am Lenora Rhodes. My place is the quarter section east of your boundary line, where Copper Creek bends. My cattle got mixed in with yours sometime in the last 2 weeks, and I am here to sort them out and brand what is mine." A murmur moved through the gathered cowboys like wind through tall grass. Monroe held her gaze and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. It was not attraction, not yet, or at least that was what he told himself. It was more like the particular feeling a man gets when he encounters something that does not fit any category he has prepared for. "Your cattle," he said carefully, "that is what I said. And your iron." She held it up slightly as if to confirm it was real. "That is also what I said." He looked at the iron. The mark on it was a capital R with a bar beneath it, clean and well-made, the work of a competent smith. He looked back at her face and found nothing in it that resembled a lie or a bluff, or the particular brand of nervous calculation that people showed when they were trying to take something that did not belong to them. "How many head do you think got mixed in?" he asked. "I counted my herd 2 weeks ago and I was at 63. I know each one by sight well enough. I will not brand anything I cannot identify as mine." Monroe studied her for another long moment, Behind him, he could feel Dade and the other men watching with a quality of attention that was partly professional curiosity and partly the simple entertainment of watching something they had never seen before. "All right," Monroe said finally. "You are welcome to walk the holding pens. If you can point out your cattle, I have no objection to you branding them before we move on." Something in her face eased, not softened exactly, but eased, like a rope that had been pulled taut and was now allowed a fraction of slack. "I appreciate that," she said, and she almost sounded like she had not been entirely certain he would say it. "You came a long way alone," he said, not accusingly, just observing. "From the Rhodes Quarter section, that is almost 8 miles. 7.5, she said. "And I have been riding 7.5 miles alone since I was 14, so it is not the kind of thing that keeps me up at night." He almost smiled at that. He did not quite, but almost. "Fair enough. Dade, show Miss Rhodes to the holding pens. It is Mrs. Rhodes," she said quietly, and then she followed Dade without looking back at Monroe. The name landed on him oddly. He turned back to the fire and picked up the iron and went back to work, but something about her presence remained in his peripheral awareness for the rest of the morning in a way that was difficult to explain. Like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples kept going. Lenora moved through the holding pens with a quiet efficiency that earned the reluctant respect of every man watching her. She did not rush, and she did not second-guess herself. She walked the length of each pen, studying the cattle with the focused attention of a woman who had spent years learning to read animals the way other people read books. She pointed out 11 head and described each one in enough detail: the notched ear on the big roan, the particular white patch on the chest of the heifer, the way one of the steers always stood with its weight shifted left, that not even the most skeptical of the cowboys could claim she was guessing. Monroe watched from a distance while she heated her iron in the edge of one of the fires, accepted the help of one of his men to handle the first calf without being asked, and went to work with the calm confidence of someone who had been doing this her whole life. She was not performing anything for anybody. She was simply doing what she had come to do. It was Dade who finally said, quiet and curious, at Monroe's elbow, "Where is Mr. Rhodes?" "Widow," said Pearl, who had appeared from nowhere the way she always did. Pearl was 60 years old, small, and apparently capable of moving through space without making any sound whatsoever. She had been the Kendrick family's cook since before Monroe was born and had declared herself a permanent fixture of the land in a way that nobody had ever found the courage to dispute. "I heard she came out with her husband, Thomas Rhodes, 2 years back. He died last winter. Fever, I think." Monroe looked at Lenora again. "He thought about riding 7.5 miles alone with your own branding iron because you had no choice, because there was nobody else to do it, because the cattle were yours and you had worked too hard to let them disappear into someone else's herd. He thought about doing all of that on a cold Wyoming spring morning without complaining, without asking for sympathy, without making any of it anything other than practical business. He felt something settle into a quiet, different kind of noticing. By late morning, she had branded all 11 of her cattle and stood back from the last one, wiped her forearm across her brow, and turned to find Monroe standing a few yards behind her. She had not heard him approach. "That is all of them," she said. "I counted," he said. "You are good at that." She looked at him. "My husband taught me most of it," she said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes went somewhere briefly, somewhere internal that she did not appear inclined to share with a stranger. "He was good with cattle. We came out here from Ohio with 60 head and a plan." 63 now," Monroe said. She smiled for the first time, and it was a quick thing, a little wry, a little proud. 63. "Your fence line runs along the eastern tributary," Monroe said. "The one that cuts through the lower pasture." "It does. That fence has been giving you trouble. I could see it when I rode that boundary last week. 3 posts are down." She went still in a careful way. "I am aware of that." "I was not accusing you of anything," he said quickly. "Just observing. The spring floods came hard this year. Half my fence lines need work too." He paused. "If you would let us, we could send a man over to help you reset those posts. It would take half a day for 2 people instead of a full day for 1, and if the fence is down, that is how your cattle keep mixing in with mine." She studied him for a moment with those measuring eyes. "Why would you do that?" she asked, and the question was not rude. It was genuine, the question of a woman who had learned that there was usually a calculation behind generosity. "Because it is a practical solution," he said simply, "and because good neighbors make life easier for everybody in this territory. Wyoming winters do not care about property lines. People out here help each other or they do not survive." She held his gaze and he could see her turning something over in her mind, testing it for hidden angles. "All right," she said finally. "I would be grateful for that. I will send Dade over on Thursday." "I will have him fed," she said, and picked up her branding iron and walked back to her horse. Monroe watched her go and Pearl materialized at his side again with the unsettling punctuality she always demonstrated when something interesting was happening. "She is something else," Pearl said. "She is capable," Monroe said. Pearl made a sound that communicated a very large number of things simultaneously without being any particular word. Dade went to the Rhodes place on Thursday and came back on Friday evening with news that the fence was fixed, that Mrs. Rhodes had fed him a meal that he described in the exact tone of voice a man uses when he has been surprised by something wonderful, and that her place was small but had been kept up with a discipline that suggested she was fighting hard to keep it viable. "Her barn needs work," Dade said, helping himself to a second cup of coffee at Monroe's kitchen table. "The south wall is bowing. Come a bad winter and that whole thing could come down on her stock." Monroe was reading a letter from the land office and did not look up. "Is that right?" he said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "She knows it too," Dade said. "She was looking at it when I left, the way you look at a problem you know you have to solve but you have not figured out how yet." Monroe set down his letter. He thought about a woman standing alone in front of a failing barn in the late afternoon light, doing the math on whether she could fix it before the first hard frost, and he thought about what it cost a person to stand in front of a problem like that without flinching. He told himself that he would have done the same for any neighbor. He told himself that several more times over the following week. The following Sunday he rode out to her place on the pretext of checking his own fence line, which ran about a mile west of her property. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the fence check was a pretext about halfway along the ride, but he continued anyway because he was not sure what else to do with the feeling that had been sitting in his chest since the morning she had ridden into his branding ground. She was in her vegetable garden when he arrived, crouched between the rows with her sleeves rolled up, and she looked up when she heard his horse and shaded her eyes against the sun. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, sounding neither surprised nor entirely unsurprised. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said, and dismounted. "I was checking my eastern fence line. Thought I would stop by." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. She was wearing a different shirt today, blue instead of the faded brown she had worn at the branding, and her hair was down from its pins, pulled back simply instead. He noticed that it was longer than he had realized and had a slight wave to it that the hat had been hiding. "Would you like some water?" she asked. "I have a jug cooling in the well." "That would be fine, thank you." They sat on her porch steps, which were solid and clean-swept, and he drank the water, which was cold and tasted of stone and deep earth the way well water does, and he looked out over her land and thought about what it meant to hold onto something this hard. "You have done well with this place," he said. "Thomas picked the location," she said. "He had a good eye for land. He found this quarter section through the railroad office back in Ohio, sight unseen, but he studied the surveys so carefully that by the time we arrived, he recognized every hill and creek bend like he had already been here." She paused. "He was right about it being good land." "He was," Monroe agreed. He turned his cup in his hands. "What will you do with it, long term?" She looked at him steadily. "Keep it, build it, leave something behind worth leaving." He felt the weight of that and respected it completely. He understood it. His father had felt the same way about Copper Creek Ranch, had said almost exactly the same thing in different words on different occasions, and Monroe had inherited not just the land but the conviction that went with it. "The barn," he said, because he was not the kind of man who circled things forever. Her chin came up a degree. "The barn is my business." "It is," he agreed. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I am suggesting that if you would allow it, I could bring some men over and we could have it reinforced in a week. The materials would cost you for the lumber, but the labor would be a trade. I can tell you what I would want in return." She was quiet for a moment. "What would you want?" "Use of your grazing on the east side of Copper Creek for 6 weeks in late summer. That east corridor is yours by the deed line and my cattle have been pushing up against it. If I could run 20 head through there for 6 weeks, it would give my main pasture time to recover." She thought about this carefully and he waited, which was something he was moderately good at. "That seems fair," she said. "More than fair, actually." "It is fair," he said. "It is not charity. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him with something that had shifted slightly from the measuring look she had given him before. This was different. This was something more like recognition. "You are clear," she said. "Yes, all right, I accept your terms." He stood to go and she stood too, and they were closer than they had been in the moment of standing, the porch step being narrow, and neither of them moved back for just a second. He was aware of the smell of turned earth and something like lavender from her hair, and she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes, and he felt the thing in his chest tighten, and then release in a way that made him simultaneously want to say something and unable to remember what any words were for. He stepped back down to the ground and put his hat back on. "I will come by Wednesday with a crew." "Wednesday," she said. "I will have coffee ready." He rode back to Copper Creek and spent the rest of the evening being deeply unhelpful at dinner, because he kept losing track of what Pearl was saying to him midway through her sentences. The barn repair took 4 days rather than a week, because Lenora turned out to be not merely willing to help but genuinely useful in a way that reorganized the whole project. She knew her barn's measurements precisely, had already identified exactly which boards were load-bearing and which were cosmetic rot, and had a plan sketched out on a piece of brown paper that she produced from her kitchen table with the matter-of-fact manner of an engineer presenting a report. Monroe's crew, which was 4 men including Dade, spent the first hour reviewing her sketch and then proceeded with the efficiency of men who had been given accurate information for once. Lenora worked alongside them without anyone inviting her to do so, and without anyone presuming to tell her she should not, because a single look at how she handled herself around tools and lumber made the point clearly. Monroe found himself manufacturing excuses to work near her side of the project more than was strictly necessary. On the 3rd day, she was on a ladder nailing a board into the upper section of the south wall while he was below handing up materials, and she said without looking down, "Why are you not married?" The question was so direct that he laughed out loud, which surprised him because laughing was not something he did readily. "I am working on this barn," he said. She glanced down at him and the corner of her mouth curved. "I mean in general." He thought about it honestly. "I have not found anyone who felt like the right kind of company." "What is the right kind?" she asked, going back to her nailing with the unhurried efficiency that characterized everything she did. "Someone who does not need to be explained to," he said, and then felt surprised by his own answer because it was more honest than he had intended. She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas was like that," she said. "We could go half a day without talking and it felt like a full conversation." "That sounds exactly right," Monroe said quietly. She came down the ladder a few minutes later to collect more nails and stood beside him at the supply table, and he handed her what she needed, and their fingers overlapped briefly on the tin of nails, and neither of them made a thing of it, but neither of them moved immediately either. Dade, from across the barn, found a sudden urgent need to look in the completely opposite direction. On the 4th day, the barn was finished. The south wall was solid and straight, the reinforcing beams were set, and the whole structure had been retightened in ways that would hold through 3 or 4 winters at minimum. Lenora stood back and looked at it with a quiet satisfaction that Monroe felt privileged to witness, the private pleasure of someone who loves something and has seen it saved. She turned to his crew and said, "You are all welcome at my table tonight," and the men accepted with the particular enthusiasm of people who had heard about her cooking from Dade. That evening, around her kitchen table that was too small for 6 people, but managed it anyway with goodwill and creative chair arrangement, Monroe watched her serve food and tell a story about a calf she had delivered in February in the middle of a snowstorm, and make every man at the table laugh twice. And he felt the thing in his chest do something complicated and warm and undeniable that he knew was not going to go away on its own. After the crew had ridden back, he stayed to help her clear the table, because it seemed like the natural thing to do, and because he was not ready to leave, and he was honest enough to stop pretending that the reason was anything other than what it was. "You do not have to stay," she said, carrying dishes to the basin. "I know," he said, and picked up the stack of plates. She glanced at him sideways and then away, but he saw the small, careful smile she did not quite manage to suppress. They washed dishes in the lamplight, the evening coming down outside, the cattle making their settling sounds in the newly solid barn, and the silence between them was the kind that does not need filling. He left when it was full dark and rode home under a sky thick with stars, and felt the Wyoming night press in on all sides with its enormous indifferent beauty. And he thought that, for the first time in a long time, the ranch waiting for him at the end of the ride felt less like a responsibility and more like a place to get back to. The summer came on hard and gold, and the grass went high on the eastern corridor of Copper Creek, the way it always did when the spring had been wet enough. True to their agreement, Monroe moved 20 head of his cattle through Lenora's eastern pasture in the first week of July, and this meant that he had a legitimate and practical reason to be in regular contact with her about the progress of the grazing rotation, which he told himself was the only reason he was riding over to her place every 4 or 5 days. He brought her family's mail from town twice because he was going anyway, and it was on the way. She brought a jar of preserved plums to his ranch cook Pearl, who received them with the air of someone accepting a diplomatic offering, and then found an opportunity later to tell Monroe that Mrs. Rhodes had very good hands and excellent common sense, which from Pearl was the equivalent of writing a recommendation letter in gold ink. Monroe's older sister, Clara, came to visit from Cheyenne in July and spent a week at the ranch being bright and sharp and asking Monroe pointed questions at breakfast. Clara was 34, married to a banker, and had a mind like a steel trap wrapped in silk. "Tell me about the woman with the branding iron," Clara said on her second morning, over eggs. Monroe looked up. "Where did you hear about that?" "Dade," she said pleasantly, "and Pearl. And also the man at the feed store in town who called her a remarkable woman, and then gave me an unsolicited lecture about property rights that I mostly ignored." "Her name is Lenora Rhodes," Monroe said. "She is a neighbor." Clara looked at him over her coffee cup in a way that communicated that she was fully aware this sentence contained more information than he was currently willing to share, and that she was patient. "She is a widow," he added. "Came out from Ohio with her husband 2 years ago. He died last winter. She is running the cattle operation on her own." "And," Clara said, "and nothing," he said, "she is a neighbor." Clara smiled and said nothing else, which was somehow more disconcerting than if she had said a great deal. He invited Lenora to dinner at Copper Creek that Friday in what he framed as a neighborly gesture, and which Clara attended with the barely contained delight of someone who has been given exactly what they wanted for their birthday. Lenora arrived on her bay mare as the sun was going down, still in her work clothes but with her hair brushed out and a simple ribbon at the back of it, and she shook Clara's hand firmly and sat down at the Kendrick dining table and talked to Clara about Ohio and Wyoming and cattle prices, and the unreliability of certain supply merchants in the nearest town of Rawlins, with the ease of a woman who was used to making her own way in any room. Monroe watched the two of them talk and felt something settle in him with the completeness of a bone finding its socket. Clara left the following Tuesday. Her last words to Monroe at the door of the stage, spoken quietly while the driver loaded her trunk, were, "Do not be an idiot about this, Monroe. Good things do not wait forever." He stood in the road and watched the stage disappear and thought about that for several days. The thing that changed everything, or rather the thing that clarified everything, happened in the third week of August when a man came to the territory. His name was Gerald Harker, and he was what passed in that era and place for a land speculator, a man who had money from somewhere unspecified and a habit of targeting isolated properties owned by people with limited legal resources. He had been working his way through the Wyoming territory for 2 years, finding widows' properties and small operations running on thin margins, offering prices that sounded large to people who did not know the actual value of the land, and using a combination of financial pressure and legal maneuvering when persuasion failed. Monroe learned about Harker through a combination of the Rawlins newspaper and a long letter from a rancher named Ellis, 60 miles south, who had watched Harker work his way through that region the previous spring and wanted to alert anyone in his path. He learned that Harker had been to the Rhodes place on a Thursday when Monroe was not around and had left a written offer with Lenora for her quarter section at a price that was, Monroe calculated after looking at current land values, approximately 40% below what the land was actually worth. He did not know about any of this until Saturday, when he rode over on the pretext of checking the fence, and Lenora met him on the porch with a piece of paper in her hand and a look on her face that was doing its level best to be calm but was not quite managing it. "Do you know a man named Harker?" she asked. He dismounted. "I know of him. Ellis wrote me about him a week ago. I was going to come tell you, but I did not want to worry you unnecessarily." He paused. "I should have come sooner. I am sorry about that." She handed him the paper and watched his face as he read it. He read it twice carefully and handed it back. "That price is almost half what this land is worth," he said. "I suspected as much," she said. "I did not accept it. I told him I would need time to consider it because I did not know who he was or what his methods were." "His methods," Monroe said carefully, "when politeness does not work, have included filing nuisance claims with the land office and finding ways to create legal complications for properties he wants. It does not always work, but it costs money and time to fight, and he knows that." The color in her face went quiet in a way that meant she was afraid but not willing to show it fully. He recognized the look because it was one he associated with people who have been afraid before and have learned to carry it rather than give in to it. "I am not selling," she said. "No," he said, and his voice had a steadiness in it that he intended her to feel. "You are not. And I want to make sure Harker understands that you have the full support of your neighbors in that position, if it would help." She looked at him for a long moment. "You would do that?" "I would do that," he said. "I will also write to the land office in Cheyenne with a formal record of his practices, and I know the territorial judge from way back. Harker's kind of legal harassment works best in the dark. In the daylight, with names and dates and a judge who knows the law, it falls apart quickly." She sat down on the porch step and set the paper on her knee and stared at it. He sat beside her. "Thomas and I worked so hard for this," she said quietly. "We saved for 8 years before we could afford the train and the cattle and the supplies." He studied land law in the evenings after work, at a job he hated, for 2 years, so that we would not make a mistake when we arrived. "We came out here and built that barn and dug that well and planted that garden, and we did everything right." She stopped. "I am not going to give it away to some man who shows up from nowhere with a low number on a piece of paper." "No," Monroe said. "You are absolutely not." She looked at him with an expression that cracked something open in the direction of trust, the real kind, the kind that comes after grief and hard work and the slow testing of a person's word against their actions. "Why are you so certain?" she asked. He looked at her. He had been carrying the answer to this question around with him for weeks. He had been careful with it the way you are careful with something you know is fragile until you also know it is strong enough to hold. Because this land is yours, he said. You earned it twice, first with Thomas and then alone. Nobody with any decency and any understanding of what that means would let a man like Harker take it from you. She held his gaze and he did not look away. Thank you, she said, and the words were small but the weight behind them was enormous. He stayed for another hour and they talked about the specific steps he would take and what she should say or not say if Harker came back. And he wrote down the name of the territorial judge and 3 other ranchers in the area who had good standing with the land office and would sign a letter of support if asked. When he stood up to leave, she stood too, and they were on the porch steps again, close the way that narrow spaces make you close, and this time she spoke first. Monroe, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it rang in the evening air between them like a bell tone. He went very still. I think, she said slowly and carefully, like someone choosing exactly the right words for something that matters, that you have been an extraordinary neighbor. He understood that she was saying something more than the words. He understood it completely. Lenora, he said, and his voice came out quieter and more certain than he had planned. I think I have been attempting to be a good neighbor because it was the most available option while I figured out what else I wanted to be. She looked at him with those eyes that gave nothing away and everything away simultaneously and said, What did you figure out? That I would very much like to call on you, he said, if you are willing. Properly, with your permission. The evening light was doing something gold and gentle on her face. She was quiet for just long enough to make him aware of his own heartbeat in a new and specific way. I am willing, she said. He exhaled slowly and she almost smiled again, that quick private curve that he was beginning to think of as specifically his, the one she gave things that surprised her into pleasure. He rode home in the dark again with the stars overhead and the Wyoming night enormous and fragrant around him. And this time the feeling in his chest was not confusion or uncertainty. It was the particular clear warmth of a man who knows what he is going home to think about. He called on her the following Sunday with his good hat, and a pie Pearl had made under protest, but with unmistakable care. And Lenora met him at the door in a blue dress that she had probably worn for other things, and that did things to the late summer light that Monroe found it difficult not to stare at. And they sat on her porch for 2 hours and talked about everything and nothing. The way you do when you are learning someone, and every piece of information is interesting simply because it belongs to them. He learned that she had been born in Cincinnati, that she had read every book she could find as a child because her family had not had the money for much else, and the library was free. That she had taught herself to do arithmetic by keeping the accounts for her father's dry goods store from the age of 12. That she had a sense of humor that came out sideways and dry, the kind that ambushes you when you are not expecting it. That she was afraid of almost nothing except losing this land, and that fear she carried with the dignity of a woman who had decided fear was only acceptable if it made her work harder rather than less. He told her about his father, who had come to Wyoming from Virginia in the 1850s with $40 and a horse, and had built Copper Creek from nothing. About the winter when Monroe was 15, and a blizzard had killed 40 head, and his father had sat at the kitchen table for one evening, and then stood up the next morning and started over. About his own particular loneliness, which he had never actually said out loud to anyone, the specific quiet that comes from being responsible for everything and having nobody to share the weight of it with. She listened to that last part with a quality of attention that told him she understood it from the inside, not just as an observer. The sun went all the way down while they talked, and the stars came out, and neither of them mentioned the time. When he finally stood to go, she walked with him to his horse, and he gathered his reins and turned to say good night and found her looking up at him with something simple and open in her face, the kind of look that does not happen until someone has decided to stop being careful. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, and she leaned very slightly into his hand, just slightly, just enough, and he thought that he had never been so moved by something so small. "Next Sunday," he said. "Next Sunday," she said. Harker came back on a Wednesday. Monroe was told about it on Thursday morning when Lenora appeared at the Copper Creek gate on her bay mare with the look of someone who has slept badly and been angry for 12 hours and wants to be practical about it. He came out to meet her and could read the whole of it in her face before she said a word. "What did he do?" Monroe asked. "He has filed a complaint with the land office," she said. "Some kind of disputed survey claim. He is saying the original survey of Thomas's section was incorrectly measured and that the actual deed line puts my eastern boundary 40 yards west of where I have always understood it to be. If he is right, my fence is on his land." She paused. "He has also produced documents suggesting he holds a purchase option on the land adjacent to mine, which, if the survey correction stands, would make my grazing corridor effectively his." Monroe absorbed this. "Let me see the papers." She handed them over and he read them on his porch with Pearl hovering at the doorway pretending to dry dishes. He read carefully because his father had taught him to read legal documents the way you read trail sign, slowly and looking for what was not there as much as what was. "This survey document," he said. "The name on it is W.J. Billings. I know that name. He is a surveyor out of Denver who lost his license 2 years ago for falsifying measurements on a claim dispute in Colorado. He is Harker's instrument." Lenora was very still. "Can you prove that?" "I can write to the Colorado Territorial Office. I can also write to the judge, and I can ride to Rawlins today to speak with the land office recorder in person and put the facts about Billings on the official record before Harker gets there to do his own version of events." He folded the papers and handed them back. "This is not a hopeless situation. It is designed to look hopeless, which is different." She took the papers and held them, and he could see the effort it was taking her to stay on the right side of frightened. "Come inside," he said. "Let Pearl feed you and let me write some letters and we will start pulling this apart." She looked at him with a complicated expression. "I do not want to be someone who always needs rescuing," she said. "You came here with the papers," he said. "You already knew what you needed. You are not being rescued. We are solving a problem together." She considered this, and then dismounted and followed him inside. Pearl produced coffee and biscuits with the efficiency of someone who had been secretly waiting for this development, and Monroe wrote 4 letters at his desk, while Lenora sat at his kitchen table, and, characteristically, asked Pearl if there was anything she could help with, and then spent the next hour helping Pearl put up a shelf that had been hanging loose for 3 weeks while Monroe wrote. He took the letters to Rawlins himself that afternoon, riding hard, and spoke directly to the land office recorder, a careful and honest man named Samuel Voss, who had lived in the territory long enough to know Gerald Harker's name and receive the information about the Billings connection with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this particular conversation. It took 3 weeks for the matter to move through the proper channels, 3 weeks during which Monroe rode to Lenora's place every 2 or 3 days, not always for long, sometimes just to make sure nothing else had been delivered, sometimes to sit on the porch for an hour and let her know by his presence that she was not standing alone. The response from the Colorado Territorial Office confirmed everything about W.J. Billings. The territorial judge wrote a clear and thorough letter to the Rawlins Land Office. Samuel Voss rejected Harker's complaint and placed a formal note in the record about the fraudulent survey. 2 neighboring ranchers, a man named Carver and a man named Pitts, added their own letters attesting to the accepted boundary of the Rhodes section as it had always been understood. Harker left the territory within a month. Monroe heard he had gone to Utah, where presumably other isolated properties awaited his attention, and he wrote a letter to a rancher he knew in that territory to pass along what he knew, because the least you could do was warn people. On the afternoon that Voss's final letter arrived confirming the complaint had been dismissed and the original survey upheld, Monroe rode over to Lenora's with the letter in his coat pocket and found her in the garden again, which had by now produced a substantial amount of produce that she was in the process of canning for winter. He handed her the letter, and she read it on the porch steps with the August sun on her face, and when she finished, she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and closed her eyes for a moment in a way that had nothing performative about it. Just pure relief, the private kind, the kind you allow yourself when the danger is finally and truly past. He sat beside her and waited. When she opened her eyes, there was something wet at the corner of one of them that she brushed away with the back of her hand in a matter-of-fact manner that broke his heart a little. "Thomas would have liked you," she said. He felt the weight of that. "I think I would have liked him," he said. She looked out at her land, her garden, her barn with its solid south wall, her small but real operation that she had held together alone through a Wyoming winter and a land speculator, and about 1,000 daily difficulties that nobody saw because she dealt with them before they became crises. "I am not ready to stop missing him," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. I do not think that is something that goes away on a schedule." "No," Monroe said, "it is not, and I would not ask it to." He paused. "I am not asking you to replace anything or forget anything. I am not asking anything of you except to let me be here, whatever that means to you." She turned and looked at him, and this time when her eyes met his they were fully open, no measuring, no careful holding back, just the direct and undefended look of a woman who has decided something. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and deliberate, and he put his hand against her jaw and kissed her back. And it was the kind of kiss that carries the full weight of everything that led to it. The branding ground and the barn and the letters and the Sunday evenings, and all the miles between their two properties that had been turning into something else for months. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead briefly against his chin, and he felt her exhale slowly and completely. "I think," she said, "that you are the right kind of company." He laughed, soft and low, and she lifted her head and looked at him with that quick private smile. "I believe I told you I was looking for that," he said. "You did," she said. "I was paying attention." He cupped her face in his two rough hands, and she let him, and the summer went on around them, gold and endless and entirely indifferent to the two of them sitting on a porch in Wyoming falling in love, which is exactly how the best kind of love happens. September came, and with it, the first cool edge in the air at night, and the beginning of the preparations that everyone in the territory made for winter, checking stores and reinforcing structures and moving cattle to winter pastures. Monroe and Lenora fell into a rhythm that was neither rushed nor hesitant, the rhythm of two people who trust each other enough to take their time. He came to Sunday dinner every week. She came to the ranch on Thursdays when she had business in the direction of Rawlins and would stop at Copper Creek on the way back. Pearl stopped pretending to have things to do in other rooms when they were together and simply sat at the table with them and participated in the conversation, which Monroe initially found slightly amusing and then found he genuinely preferred because Pearl was sharper and funnier than most people gave her credit for. Clara wrote from Cheyenne in September, and the letter said, among other things, "I have heard very specific things from Dade's cousin about a certain widow and a certain stubborn brother of mine, and I want you to know that I am unreservedly delighted, and also if you do not write back with details within 2 weeks, I will come back to Wyoming and extract them in person." Monroe wrote back with details. Clara's response to the details was a single line that said, "She fixed the fence while Dade was there, Monroe. I knew from that sentence." One evening in late September, with the mountains going purple at dusk and the smell of wood smoke beginning to take on its winter character, they were sitting on her porch in the last of the light, and he said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "I want to ask you something that I want you to take all the time you need with," he said. "There is no urgency to the answer, I mean that." She turned to look at him. He held her gaze and said, "I would like to marry you, Lenora." Not to solve a problem, or to make anything more convenient, or because the territory expects it? Because I want to spend my mornings knowing where you are and my evenings sitting where I can reach you. He paused. Because you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and being near you makes me a better version of myself, and I cannot imagine choosing any other direction. She was very quiet. He waited, because he had meant what he said about time. I have been thinking about this too, she said slowly. I have been thinking about whether I could do this again, give someone a piece of myself the way you do when you marry. I was not sure I had it in me. After Thomas, I spent a long time believing that what I had given away in that grief was gone, and that the pieces left were enough to run a ranch and not much more. She turned her hands over in her lap. And then you came to my branding ground and argued with me about my own cattle, and I found myself thinking about you all the way home. He felt something like joy, the deep, ordinary kind that does not announce itself loudly. You did not argue with me, he said. I actually capitulated almost immediately. You were very reasonable about it, she conceded. It was disarming. He took her hand and she let him and held it the way she held everything, firmly and without pretense. Yes, she said, my answer is yes, but I want to keep my land. Lenora, he said, I would never ask you to give up your land. It is yours. It will always be yours. I know, she said. I know that. I needed to say it out loud once and know that you heard it. I heard it, he said. She squeezed his hand. Then yes, my answer is yes. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the simple, direct way he did everything, and she looked at him with the full, open look. And the world went quiet around them in the particular way it does when something real has been decided. They were married in November, at the small Methodist church in Rawlins, on a day that had started cold but warmed into a pale gold afternoon that felt like a gift from a Wyoming sky that was usually less generous. Clara came from Cheyenne and sat in the front pew with her husband Franklin, who was a good-natured man who spent most of the ceremony looking fondly at his wife being moved in the various ways that Clara was moved by things that mattered to her. Pearl wore her best dress and sat beside Dade and cried in a completely undramatic way, producing a handkerchief from somewhere in her sleeve and applying it with the same efficient calm she applied to everything. Lenora wore a dress the color of deep cream that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a catalog 3 weeks before, and Monroe wore his best coat and the look of a man who has arrived at exactly the place he wanted to be and knows it. When the minister asked if he took this woman and he said yes, his voice was the steadiest thing in the room. When Lenora said yes, hers was too. They walked out of the church into the pale November sunshine, and she took his arm and he looked down at her, and she looked up at him and smiled. Not the quick private smile, but a larger one, the full one, the one she did not often give, and it was exactly what Pearl had said about his. It lit up the whole afternoon. The reception was at Copper Creek Ranch, where Pearl had been cooking for 2 days straight, and Dade had strung lanterns on the porch that flickered gold into the cold evening. And people came from 3 properties over because word travels fast in that territory, and an occasion like this was not to be missed. They danced on the porch boards, there not being enough room inside, and the fiddler who had been persuaded in from Rawlins played until his arms were tired. And Monroe was not in his natural element dancing, but he managed adequately, and Lenora was better at it than she had ever mentioned, which surprised him pleasantly. You have been hiding things, he said, turning her in the lamplight. I have been revealing things in sequence, she said. You should have more questions left or it gets dull. I do not think there is a version of you that gets dull, he said, and she ducked her head against his shoulder briefly, a small involuntary gesture that he felt like a warmth in his chest. They stayed at Copper Creek that winter, which had been decided practically because the ranch was larger and better equipped for the season, and the Rhodes Quarter section was a 2-hour ride that they made every week to check on things and maintain what needed maintaining. Lenora's cattle had been brought over to winter on the Copper Creek pasture under the joint agreement that in spring they would return to the Rhodes land with whatever increase the winter produced. The winter was hard, as Wyoming winters are without exception, but it was the particular hard that is manageable when it is shared. Monroe had never fully understood until that winter what it cost him to carry everything alone, because he had been doing it alone for so long that he had forgotten what the weight felt like. Having Lenora across the table in the evening changed his whole experience of the days, not because she made the problems go away, but because the problems sat differently when you could look up from them and find someone looking back. She read in the evenings, which he found quietly wonderful, the particular focused stillness of her at the far end of the kitchen table with a book, the lamp warm on her face. She had brought a small collection of books from her own house, adding them to the single shelf Monroe had in the main room, and she organized the combined collection with a system that she explained once and that he subsequently used and found entirely logical. In February, she told him she was expecting. He was at the stove when she told him, and he turned around and looked at her with an expression she later described as the first time she had seen him look genuinely unprepared. And he crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long time without saying anything. And when he did speak, it was only to say her name, quietly, in that tone that she had come to understand, meant that all the other words were present but did not need to be said. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I feel very much like myself except in the morning when I feel considerably less like myself." He laughed a little and pulled her against him, and she rested her head against his chest, and he held her there in the winter kitchen with the stove warm and the cold pressing at the windows, and felt the future open in front of them with a scope that was almost overwhelming. Spring came again, as it always does, green and loud with water and bird song, and the returning smell of everything that had been frozen coming back to life. Lenora's cattle were moved back to the Rhodes pasture, now numbering 71 head after a good wintering, and she rode over with Monroe to make the count herself, standing in the morning light with her tally sheet and her characteristic precision, visibly satisfied. 71, she said, making the final mark. Starting to be a real herd, Monroe said. Thomas would say it was already a real herd, she said, with the small, quiet smile she had for Thomas's memory, the one Monroe had learned to recognize as not grief so much as genuine fond remembrance, the kind that has made its peace with itself. He would be right, Monroe said. The Rhodes land got its regular attention through the spring, with Monroe making sure that the fence held, and the water stayed clean, and the operation moved forward with the same intention that Lenora had always brought to it. He understood, fully and without reservation, that this land was hers in a way that went beyond property law, that it carried Thomas Rhodes's memory and Lenora's determination, and 8 years of Ohio savings and 2 years of Wyoming building, and that keeping it well was an act of respect for all of that. He hired on a young man in the spring to help manage both properties as the operation grew, a quiet and reliable hand named Ben Sawyer who had good instincts with cattle and did not talk more than necessary, which was a quality Monroe valued. Their son was born in September of 1879 on a Golden Tuesday morning, and they named him Thomas Monroe Kendrick, because some names carry weight that needs to be honored, and because Lenora wanted her husband's son to carry his grandfather's name, and Monroe thought that was exactly right. Thomas Monroe was, from his first moments, a loud and emphatic person who had his mother's dark hair and his father's wide, serious eyes, and an apparent opinion about everything. Monroe held him for the first time in the bedroom at Copper Creek, with the September light coming through the curtains, and felt something that he had no adequate language for, a vast and clean emotion that made the usual quality of his feeling about the world seem dim by comparison. "He has your jaw," Lenora said from the bed, with the look of someone who has just done the hardest thing they have ever done and is moderately triumphant about it. "Pearl will be insufferable about him," Monroe said. "Pearl is already in the kitchen making a cake," Lenora said. "She started when my labor started, I think, We are going to have a great deal of cake." "That seems appropriate," Monroe said, looking down at his son. Pearl was indeed insufferable about Thomas Monroe, but in the best possible way, the way of a person who has watched a house be lonely for years and is deeply gratified by its becoming something else. Clara came in October and spent 2 weeks holding the baby and talking to Lenora for hours about things that Monroe was not always included in, which he found he did not mind at all. Watching his wife and his sister develop the kind of friendship that happens between women who recognize each other's quality and are simply glad to know each other. The land, both the Kendrick land and the Rhodes land, thrived in the years that followed the way land does when it is worked with knowledge and care and intention. Monroe and Lenora made a habit, early in their marriage, of walking the fence lines together on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, which gave them a standing time to talk about both properties and about whatever else was in their heads, and which they continued doing through the years in the particular companionable way of two people who are genuinely each other's preference for company. The cattle on the Rhodes land grew to 120 head by 1881, which represented a real achievement for a quarter-section operation, and Lenora began selling to buyers who came from as far east as Cheyenne, negotiating prices with the same direct competence she brought to everything. In the spring of 1882, they had a second child, a boy named James Carver Kendrick, who had his father's coloring and his mother's determined quality, and a temperament that was both sunnier and more stubborn than either of his parents, which Pearl said was a specific kind of divine humor. Between Thomas and James, Lenora had lost a pregnancy in the winter of 1880, quietly and with the particular grief that loss brings, and Monroe had sat with her through it in the way she needed him to, which was mostly presence and steadiness, and not trying to make it smaller or larger than it was. They did not talk about it at length, but they did not avoid it either, and the weight of it sat in the house for some months, and then gradually became part of the accumulated history of their life together, the kind of thing that does not disappear but does not dominate. James Carver grew up watching his mother run cattle and his father run the ranch, and did not seem to see any distinction in those activities, which Lenora said, when James was 3, was the best thing she had observed in some time. Thomas Monroe, at 4, had developed a habit of following Ben Sawyer around the property, pointing at things and asking questions at a volume that suggested he believed Ben might be slightly deaf, and Ben received this with the patience of a good man who genuinely liked children. Monroe looked at his life one October evening in 1882, sitting on the porch of Copper Creek Ranch with the mountains going dark at the edges and Lenora beside him, Thomas asleep inside and James in her arms making the small, sleepy sounds of a baby going under, and thought about the spring morning 4 years earlier when a woman had ridden into his branding ground with her own iron and told him her cattle were mixed in with his. And the memory of it was so clear and so right that it felt like the beginning of a story he had always been trying to find his way to. Lenora shifted James gently against her shoulder and looked at Monroe and said, without any particular preamble, "What are you thinking about?" "The branding," he said. She tilted her head. "Spring of 78. You rode in like you owned the entire territory," he said. "I owned 11 head of it," she said. "That felt sufficient. It was extremely effective," he said. "Every man on that ground stopped working." "I was aware of that," she said. "It was the plan." He turned to look at her fully. This woman who had crossed his land with her iron and her determination, and changed the direction of everything after that. "I love you," he said, which he said regularly and always meant completely. "I love you," she said, which she said less frequently but with a weight and a specificity that meant it fully every time. James made a small sound and settled deeper into sleep, and the night came on over the Wyoming mountains in its enormous and beautiful way, and the Kendrick family sat in it together, wrapped in the particular piece of a life that has been built rather than found, earned rather than given, and which fits, like the right country always does, exactly around the people who have chosen it. The following spring, 1883, brought with it another branding season at Copper Creek, and Monroe stood at the fire with the iron in his hand and thought about marking and ownership, and what it means to claim something as yours not by force, but by work, by presence, by staying when it is difficult. And he looked across the holding pen to where Lenora was checking her own cattle, the Rhodes herd that had come over for the combined spring branding that had by now become an annual arrangement. And she looked up and found him watching and raised her eyebrows slightly in a question. He shook his head, meaning nothing, meaning only that he was looking. She went back to her count with a small private smile. Dade, who was now 28 and had been with the Kendrick ranch for going on 6 years, appeared at Monroe's elbow with the energy of a man delivering what he considers important news. "Mrs. Kendrick says she has 67 this season," Dade said. "I know," Monroe said. "She told me at breakfast. She also says there are 4 head of Kendrick cattle that wandered into her count," Dade said. "She picked them out herself before you could notice." Monroe looked over at Lenora, who was talking to Ben Sawyer with the composed attention of someone who has just done exactly what she intended to do and is moderately entertained by it. "Is that right?" Monroe said. "She said she would be happy to sort them back to you," Dade said, clearly unable to contain whatever it was he found amusing about the whole thing, "but that you owe her for the effort." Monroe set down his iron and walked across the yard to where Lenora was standing, and she turned to meet him with the full open smile, the large one, the rarest one, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her in the spring morning light and felt everything in his chest do the complicated warm thing it had been doing since the first time she stood in his branding ground and told him her cattle were mixed in with his. "My cattle are in your count," he said. "They are," she said. "You are enjoying this," he said. "Enormously," she said. He shook his head and the smile came, the one Pearl had always described as better than a kerosene lamp, and Lenora looked at it with the expression she always had for things that surprised her into pleasure. "What do I owe you?" he asked. "I will think of something," she said. He laughed and she took his hand, and they stood together in the warm spring morning on the land they had both fought for and built and loved, with their sons somewhere behind them learning to be people from the ground up, and the cattle moving and the smoke rising from the branding fires and the Laramie Mountains standing where they always stood, permanent and indifferent and magnificent, and the whole of Wyoming territory rolling out in every direction like a country that has always been wide enough for people who are brave enough to claim their piece of it. Lenora Rhodes had come to the branding ground with her own iron because she was a woman who did not wait for permission to do what needed doing, and Monroe Kendrick had looked at her and seen something he recognized and respected, and in the quiet accumulating way of real things had loved. She had marked what was hers with her own hand, and he had seen the mark and known it for what it was, not just ownership of cattle, but a declaration of the whole self, the whole life, the full unwillingness to let go of something hard-won without a fight. He had decided, watching her at that fire, that any woman who rode 7.5 miles alone with a branding iron, because the work needed doing, was exactly the kind of person worth riding any distance toward, and everything that followed had proved him completely and entirely right. They kept 2 separate deed records in the ranch office at Copper Creek, the Kendrick deed and the Rhodes deed, side by side in the same wooden box where Monroe's father had kept his own papers. Lenora had put them there herself the first winter they were married, making sure they were separate and legible and clearly labeled, and Monroe had watched her do it and understood without a single word being spoken that this was what permanence looked like to her. Not just the land itself, but the document of it, the formal and recorded proof that it was real and hers and could not be taken away. Every year at spring branding she put her iron in the fire alongside his, and they worked the combined herd together. And every year at least one person who was new to the territory saw it and asked about the 2 irons, and someone, usually Dade, told the story of the morning. A lone woman had shown up to the Kendrick branding with her own iron and said her cattle were mixed in, and every year the telling got a little more elaborate. And Monroe would look at Lenora, and she would look at him, and they would share the look of two people who know the real version, and find all the embellishments entirely acceptable. The years settled around them like the Wyoming seasons always did, in cycles of hard and beautiful, of difficult winters and abundant summers, of small losses and large gratitudes. The Rhodes land was never sold. The cattle on it grew in number and in quality. Thomas Monroe at 8 was helping with the branding with the seriousness of a boy who has understood from birth that this work matters. James Carver at 6 had a way with horses that reminded Monroe painfully and wonderfully of his own father. That particular easy patience that some people have with animals and some simply do not. Pearl continued to run the Copper Creek kitchen with the benevolent authority of someone who has correctly understood that the kitchen is the center of everything. And Monroe continued to be the kind of man who did not say a great deal but meant everything he said. And Lenora continued to be the kind of woman who had ridden across the territory with her own iron, because that was what the situation required. And she continued to be exactly that woman for the rest of her life, which was long and good, and full of all the things she had saved and fought for. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Monroe brought Lenora to the spot on the Rhodes property where the eastern tributary ran through the bend, the place where the land first clearly became hers by every line on every map, and stood beside her in the last light of a November day, and said what he had been turning over in his mind for some time. "Your father-in-law, if he were alive," Monroe said, "would see what you have done with this, and he would be proud." She looked out at the land for a long time. "Thomas's father never thought we should come," she said. "He thought Wyoming was too far and too hard and too uncertain. He said we were chasing something foolish." She paused. "I used to worry that he was right." "He was not right," Monroe said. "No," she said quietly, with a completeness that settled everything. "He was not right." She took Monroe's arm and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there at the bend in the creek as the last color left the sky, and the stars began their slow and certain appearance, one by one, over the enormous dark country that they had both chosen, and that had, in the improbable way of good things, given them each other. The cattle were theirs, the land was theirs, the years ahead were theirs. And somewhere in the Copper Creek ranch office, in a wooden box that had belonged to Monroe's father, 2 branding irons leaned together against the wall, the Kendrick iron and the Rhodes iron, side by side the way they had always been intended to be.